This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent. So welcome everybody to the May iteration within the CPSG webinar series, where we look at different topics related to planning, and we look at it from different aspects. Sometimes we look at it from the start of planning going forward, and sometimes we look back on planning from implementation, like we did with Simon last time when we were looking at the conservation excellence model to look at how we look at projects and how we could improve them in the future. In this one, I'm delighted to be able to that we're able to host a webinar that's specifically around a tool that CPSG has been developing and rolling out, and led by my colleague Caroline Lees, who's going to lead on this presentation. And so in it, we'll sort of give a little bit of context, and then Caroline will take you through it. I don't think it's, it's not a tool. It's still very much, if we were a bakery, it would still have that warm smell of coming out of the oven. There's still sort of, there's still things that we're learning about it and how to apply it within different contexts. So it's a really exciting time to be presenting this. But I will say no more and hand over to Caroline, and then if you have any questions, then put them at the moment into the chat, and I will keep an eye on that, and I'll interrupt Caroline if it's a point of clarification, and then we'll take other questions as we get towards the end of the presentation. Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. Hello, everyone. I should just say before I start that I have literally just rolled out of bed, and you are the first people that I've spoken to this morning. So I apologize if I'm tripping over my words for the first few slides. I'll try and warm up quickly. And I haven't had breakfast yet. And now that Jamie started talking about bakeries, I'm suddenly starving. So I'll try not to let that get in the way also. So I am going to talk to you about assessing to plan today. As Jamie says, it's really new. We've done about five assess to plan workshops. They've all been really, really different. They all hinge on the same basic idea, but we have found that as we move from one taxon to another, we need to make quite significant adjustments to the way that we think about things, the way that we do things. As we move from one red listing project to another, we have to think really differently about the way that we approach the A2P piece. So although we're trying to keep it anchored to some basic steps and some basic ideas, it's still a very we're still really learning constantly as we're doing. So I'm going to try and share with you kind of why we thought about doing it in the first place, and also share with you some of the examples, but we don't have very much time today to really go into those details. But we are very keen to work with people who are facing the same kinds of challenges that we've faced as we were developing this, and people who are interested in using this as a process, so that we can all kind of learn from each other. And you'll see at the bottom of this first screen a whole pile of people who've already helped us enormously in thinking about this, in getting example processes up and running, and in working with us during the process itself, and providing feedback and helping us to get it into better shape. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, I think. I don't think this is going to be a long presentation, but as Jamie said, please put something in the chat or flag to Jamie if you'd like me to stop and explain something in a bit more detail. Okay. Oh, now my screen doesn't seem to move. Hold on. That's not going to be very good. Why doesn't, oh, there we go. Now the whole presentation is going to move to the last slide, I think, because I just hit page down. Okay, seems to be stable. Right, so I think by this point, I think many of you, not all of you, will be familiar with CPSG's principles and steps, unless you've just shown up for this one webinar. So, which would be a bit intimidating. But so principles, so our principles and steps, as I think most of you will know, follow essentially well, really I think in our book it's an 8-step process, but really there were 5 big steps of planning: defining success, understanding the system, agreeing where and how we're going to intervene, specifying actions, monitoring or implementing and monitoring action, and then we have a philosophy or a set of principles that underpin the way in which we do that. So we're very focused on stakeholder inclusivity, on participatory planning and the use of science. So that's basically the way that we have been doing planning for a very long time, and our focus has been on applying that whole planning environment and those kinds of sequential steps to individual species. And we know that works quite well. And the way that in general it kind of works is that we take a species, we gather a whole pile of information on it about threats, about what the obstacles are to mitigating those threats. We try to collect information on who might be willing and able to act and to have them present in the conversation. We look at what's possible in terms of conservation for the species, what's already in place, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and we kind of pour all that into this planning conversation, which can last for 2 or 3 days in many cases, if not a bit longer. And out of the end of that, we expect to have some clarity and some forward momentum on what needs to be done, what the priorities are, who's going to take responsibility for those, what we need to do first, and how all of the people involved are going to work together as the project moves forward. So we know that kind of works, and that does help people to help species if we can get that done well. But we also know, the slide's stuck again. Okay, well, I'll just keep talking maybe while PowerPoint catches up. We also know that we've got, currently listed on the IUCN Red List, more than 35,000 threatened species. So if we're going to be moving one species at a time with workshops that take 2 to 3 days, that could be as much as 100,000 days of workshopping, which we know is just not going to be affordable. We're not going to be able to do it in the time available. Sorry, I really can't move my slides forward. Oh, what could possibly be happening? I wonder if I might have to do that. Am I frozen completely, Jamie, or is it just my slides?
It's just your slides.
Okay, it's
Yeah,
suddenly
now it's
moving
come
again.
up. Now it's coming up.
Okay, well, I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, and then eventually it seems to work. So I apologise for that. So we have a heap of species. We know that it's just not going to be affordable to do them all one species at a time, and it's just we don't really have the time. We also know when we do lots of species that occur perhaps in similar areas that are experiencing similar threats, that the plans that we do produce can be quite similar. There can be a lot of overlap in what needs to be done and who needs to do it. So we know that there's some redundancy in there. There are some inefficiencies in there. And so the A2P project was really about seeing how we could squeeze those planning resources as tightly as we could so that we could move more species more quickly from assessment through planning and into effective action. So we assume, as many others have assumed, that that's going to be about grouping species together who do overlap in their conservation needs. So A2P is aiming to identify pathways to conservation action for multi-species groups. It's to help identify the conservation stakeholders who might be involved in taking forward those multi-species groups to action. And it's about identifying the next steps and who might take them. So it's not the planning, well, it's not the multi-species planning work itself. It's taking species from being identified as threatened or as needing attention, grouping them into these multi-species groups, and then working out how we can push them further down the path to conservation. And once we've created those multi-species groups, we've identified who needs to be involved, we've identified what the next steps are, then we can get on in some cases with actual planning work for those multi-species groups, or in some cases species can be hooked into another conservation process where their needs can be taken account of. So it's really it's a middle step between assessment and conservation planning. Now, when we think about grouping species and the attention that we might give to species in multi-species planning situations, we know that it's going to be a balancing act. So if we put too much focus on individual species, we're going to be back at something that's quite inefficient and not affordable. But we also know that if we put too little focus on individual species in the sort of analysis and conservation planning piece, we're going to end up with something that delivers ineffective or poorly targeted action if we don't give enough attention to individual species needs, because they can be so idiosyncratic. So we know that it's going to be this balancing act. And so what we're looking for really in A2P is groups of species that we can really expect to respond favourably to treatment with the same kinds of conservation actions that are either taken in the same place or that are going to be taken by the same conservation stakeholders or collaborators. So we think that those are likely to be the groupings where we get most efficiencies, where the fewest species fall through the cracks, and those are likely to be the best targets for future conservation planning or for direct action. And this table here is just a sort of conceptual diagram of that, which is kind of the way that we think about A2P. And this isn't a new idea. Lots of people have thought about what it might take to construct sensible groupings for multi-species planning. And so if we look to the literature and from our own experiences, species tend to group around these 5 main bands. So there are species that live very closely together and where threats are local to that site. So, there might be a lot of pollution, a lot of agriculture, certain land use changes that are not compatible with them. There are species that are just inherently connected to particular ecosystems or habitats. So if the ecosystem or the habitat is damaged or lost, the species go with it. And there are all sorts of examples of those. So understanding the level of reliance of species on individual ecosystems or habitats or microhabitats can be a way to find efficient, effective groupings. There are threats that travel with the species rather than the areas where they live or the habitats that or ecosystems that they inhabit. So things like illegal trade, disease, sometimes roadkill can target particular kinds of species that are particularly mobile and particularly wide-ranging. Human-wildlife conflict can be connected to some species more than others. An invasive species might target particular species no matter where they are in the landscape. So there are some threats that travel with species, and sometimes they travel with multiple species. And so attacking the threat can be an effective way to think about planning. And so species that are subject to those threats can make good groupings in that way. Some species might best be considered for individual species planning, but the group aspect of that may be that they provide really excellent umbrellas or flagship species. So their needs may overlap with a lot of other species, but they themselves may be the species that can carry that. But then there can also be species that just don't really seem to overlap in their conservation needs with other species, and we imagine that there are still species that are going to need these very intensive single species planning initiatives. And then there are species that may need a particular type of attention from particular stakeholder groups. So there are species that for lots of reasons, are just have reached a point where it's extremely unlikely that they can be recovered by work that is focused on the habitat or the ecosystem or the threat, and they may need intensive care either in situ by, you know, very intensive supportive measures, translocations, particular, you know, maybe nest box provisions, food provisioning for periods of time, like enormous amounts of protection and support, or ex situ care where they're brought out of the wild, propagated in captivity, supported in captivity, and then re-released or supplemented to sites. So those kinds of species, in terms of the ATP process, can group well together because an assessment of exactly what their intensive care needs are can be a next step for them. And that can be done with a particular constituency of stakeholders who really understand that area of work. So the main tool for assessing to plan is what we call the ATP matrix. And it's essentially like that conceptual diagram that I put up a few slides ago. So it's really just a giant table. And you can see Claudine Gibson here, who did much of the work on developing ATP, pointing to one. This was a Sunderfish workshop in Singapore in 2019. And you can't see too much about it there, but if you can see my cursor, running along the bottom here, we have species. These are all species names, and the degree of redness indicates the category of IUCN threat. And up the side here, we have threats and qualities of those species that might lead to good groupings for conservation and further planning. And I'll come back to that in a second. So this is a tool that we use to help us create those groupings. And essentially, it operates like this. So along the x-axis, we put all of the species and we spatially nest them. So those species that have the biggest overlap in distribution sit next to each other. The ones that are further away sit further away, so that we can see at a glance those species that are likely to share, for example, site threats, or that are likely to benefit from site-based conservation action. Because that is probably the lion's share of the work that is often needed. And then running up the y-axis, we have those features of biology, ecology, conservation pressures or needs that the organising team thinks might lead to useful groupings for further conservation planning or action. So we need to think ahead of the process, about the kinds of things that we think will lead to useful groupings for this particular bunch of species that we're interested in moving forward. And we need to make sure that we're collecting all the information we need to be able to see which species sit most closely together in that kind of grid. And so when we're thinking about ATP, it's really useful if we have an organising team that is a subset of what we think will be the wider ATP participants. So we think of ATP like we think of other planning workshops. We recognise that it's not a full planning process in its own right, and so often it has a smaller number of participants than would be required to deal with the needs of all of those taxa. But still, we want the ATP conversation, to have a reasonable cross section of people who can really help to understand what's possible for conservation for those species, what's already in place. So we look to taxon specialists, local conservation practitioners, those with national or regional policy knowledge, and representation from potential implementers. So who might take forward this work once it's done? And to have the organising team that has a number of those skills in it is super helpful in thinking about those groupings from the outset. So in terms of the ATP steps, once we've assembled the relevant data, we would then go on to identify those multi-species groupings with a larger group of ATP participants. We would then break up into groups, take some of those groupings, clarify their conservation needs, which may involve further subgroupings. We discuss and confirm who the stakeholders would be in taking work for that group forward, and then agreeing what the next steps are in that work and who ideally present in the room might take those forward. But it might not be someone present in the room, it might be someone to whom the report is subsequently communicated. And we do like to do this as part of Red List assessment workshops or Red List assessment initiatives, because once we have all of those taxon experts together, it's a really great opportunity to add some additional expertise and really take the work that they've been doing in the assessment process and push it that step further towards having some kind of action happening for the species that have been identified as under threat. And this is the group that worked with us on the Assessing to Plan project for European hoverflies. So this is the hoverfly group. It was all done virtually last year. So to help us generate these matrices, which are a really key tool in the ATP process, we have someone called Alexi Rushman who works with us, who developed some R code that helps us to pull the information that we need out of the Red List. I should say that it doesn't have to be done using IUCN Red List data. You can construct these matrices just by hand with people, if you have people with you who have the right kind of expertise. But the IUCN Red List assessment process and the SIS database into which all the information from that is fed is a really great starting point for assessing to plan exercises, because it does have heaps of the information that is likely to be useful for helping us to group species. And it can be different in each case. And what we have found is that sometimes it's not enough on its own. Sometimes we need additional qualification of information from experts. We found that it's great if we're talking to people ahead of the Red List assessment process to think about what kinds of things might help us to group species, because it can help inform additional bits of information that might be captured during the Red List assessment process without at all stretching that process, because we recognise that has to be done quickly, it has to be done efficiently, and so we can't add layers and layers of extra information, extra questions to that process. But sometimes just the way in which things are recorded, one or two extra questions that get asked can really give us a head start when we start to build these matrices. So talking to the Red List assessors ahead of time, really thinking about the information we want to gather ahead of time, can make the Red List database an even more effective source of information for assessing to plan. But essentially, if we can use the Red List database, it's super helpful, because then we have a one-stop shop with everything in it that we need and all nicely organized. And so then we can create a working set in SIS, or at least we work with the Red List authority for the taxon to create a working set. I should say actually that we don't have to do ATP on one kind of taxon. We can do multiple taxa. Multiple different kinds of taxa. We just haven't done that yet. And in fact, we think that it would be great to be able to do that, because we'd get a lot more of those site-based groupings from that kind of work. But mostly we're finding that the Red List assessment process addresses a particular taxonomic group, and so that's all of the ATP work so far has looked at one taxonomic group. But we would like to explore layering taxonomic groups on top of each other. It would need some tweaking to this process, but that needs to be thought about on a case-by-case basis. Sorry, I'll try and stick to what's on the slide. So we need to create a working set in ICIS. So we just need in SIS. We just need to put a ring around all the species that we're interested in. We then export all of the information that's in SIS for those taxa. We convert it from the format that it comes out in so that it's more readable for us. And then we use this R code to strip out the information that we don't want to organize the information that we do want. And then what we have is essentially a giant spreadsheet like the one that you looked at that we can just color in. So that's the basic process of producing the A2P matrix. What it currently doesn't do for us, and what we would really love to work with somebody on, is the spatial nesting. So at the moment we can only organize by the large geographic groupings that are embedded in the SIS database, or in the way that the red list assessments are structured. So by country and sometimes by regions within countries. But for A2P work, we need much more fine scale nesting. Like, we want to know which species of fish are in the same lake and only in that lake. So what we want are kind of scales of endemicity to be able to nest species really effectively for grouping. And a lot of that work currently has to be done by hand. So we're looking for better ways, sharper, quicker ways to do that. We don't have it at the moment. But essentially, that's the process for developing a matrix. We draw a ring around the species we want, we export all of the information, and then we strip out the bits we do or don't want using this R code, and then just, you know, format the sheet. And so we end up with something like this, which isn't very helpful to you because obviously the font sizes are tiny here, but you can start to see the way that, you know, you can see blocks of color that might be a good starting point to say, well, that's interesting. Look at all those species that occur there that are subject to that threat. What's that about? So at the moment, if you look at red list information generally just from the website, you're searching for one species at a time. You're looking at information for one species at a time, which is great for single species planning. But this process helps us to be able to look across species, and importantly across species that are sharing the same space. And often, actually, if they're sharing the same space, they're you know, also sharing other things. So that's what a basic A2P matrix looks like in its unreadable form. And I will come back to that again in a second. And once we have our groupings, once we've done that sort of, you know, slightly technical piece, we can then use our standard facilitation tools actually to do all the other stuff. So once we have those multi-species groupings, we can treat them like a super species, if you like, and we can apply our facilitation tools that are around clarifying what the conservation needs are, but just looking at the group as a whole instead of as individual species beyond that. So we can use those tools to look at what conservation needs are, and we also have stuck again. We also have facilitation tools that help us to look at who the conservation stakeholders might be in addressing particular threats, or in working in particular areas, or with particular ecosystems. And we have similarly, yeah, I really can't move slides. And similarly, we have tools that you know, that help us with things like, so we have stakeholder analysis tools typically, we have prioritization tools, we have a whole bunch of facilitation tools that some of you will be aware of as a result of doing some of the other CPSG courses, and that allows us to get, I don't know how many slides down I am, and that allows us to get through the rest of the A2P process. So we have things like, you know, so what I've got here is just an example of the kinds of, you know, discussion processes that we went through when we looked at the hoverfly issues. So for hoverflies, we group species by microhabitat, actually. So like many invertebrates, hoverflies are, they require particular kinds of habitats to complete their life cycle. And for the threatened species, they could be grouped into 3 broad types. And so once we had that habitat type identified, we could then look at all the threats to that habitat type, and we could treat that, in fact, the habitat type and all of the species that rely on it as a single unit for conservation planning. So as we would with a single species, we would just put that then at the centre of the planning conversation and run all of our usual processes around it. Although of course not all of them, just a subset of them, because A2P doesn't take us all the way into planning. But you can kind of imagine the way that those discussions might proceed. Stakeholder analysis tools, same kind of thing. We can look at who would we need to have in the room if we were going to have a conversation about this particular area and the species that live in it and the multiple threats to them that are occurring at this site. You know, who would need to be there? What would the next steps be in getting everybody together to talk about this, and who might take those next steps? Another thing that we found was quite useful, and it depends a lot on the way that the Red List assessment is organised. But in some cases, Red List assessments are organised so lots of different assessors are feeding information about individual species or about several species into the system. And the A2P process can be a useful part of the consistency checking step in that Red List assessment. So this is an example here for the sunderfish again, so a group of freshwater fish from the Sunder region that we were looking at. And you can see here the pink crosses, or the pink box crosses, represent the threats that each of these species was considered subject to by different assessors. This is a group of species that all live in Lake Poso in central Sulawesi, and they only live in Lake Poso in central Sulawesi. And so we could pull out from the A2P matrix the fact that some assessors have tick boxes for some of these species, but not for others. Now, in some cases, that may be real. It may be that certain threats apply to some species and not others, but some of them just looked a little odd. So, for example, volcanoes in this case were considered to affect just one of the species in the lake and not the other three, or not the other five here. And so that was just something that we could discuss with assessors and say, so how are you interpreting the idea of the threat of volcanoes in this environment? And actually all of the assessors who were involved in this had a really plausible interpretation, but it had led some of them to tick the volcanoes box and others not to tick the volcanoes box as a risk. And that was really interesting actually, and we had a discussion around that. We pieced together what had happened in the lake, how we thought it had affected different species. And as a result of that, these yellow ticks actually are the ones that the group of assessors together agreed were the risks to species in that lake. The red crosses are the ones that they, when they discussed it together, decided were not sensible risks to be lodging for these species. So it can be quite, if the red listing is done in that way, and different red listing groups do their consistency checking in different ways, but this was a sort of useful extra step in this particular case. So just to give you some other real examples, these are some of the outputs for Reptiles of South Asia Assessing to Plan workshop. So we took a whole pile of species during the red listing process, put them into these sort of grouping buckets. There were a number of species that clustered around different habitats or ecosystems. So arid thorny scrublands were a type of habitat that's really important to a whole heap of these reptiles, and a number of the threatened reptiles are dependent on those areas. They're being lost quite quickly, along with some of the grasslands and lowland marshes, just because of changing land use. So the arid thorny scrublands in particular are just considered of no value, and so they end up being developed for all sorts of purposes. So there were 33 species that fell out along those three habitat types. There were existing area-based plans identified. So the site-based species, the species that clustered around particular sites, there were 38 of those. They clustered around different sites. And 6 of those sites, in conjunction with some KBA analyses, were selected for stakeholder awareness and action planning workshops that people thought would be a useful next step for all of those species. 41 species in in total, actually, that doesn't add up there. There must have been, sorry, there must have been a mix up there, but there were 28 suggested KBAs for this whole assessment workshop. And there were a whole pile of species that were suggested for inclusion in the next steps towards clarifying, defining those KBAs and getting some management up and running for them. And there were existing area-based plans for a number of these areas, into which there were people present at the workshop who felt these species could be slotted into. So getting species connected with area-based plans for these areas where they might be restricted to is a really good and efficient way of getting their needs attended to. So having identified the specific needs of this species, those species could then be just woven into these existing plans. So there was, for example, there was a plan up in the Western Ghats for some rocky outcrops. There's already a big campaign and a lot of work ongoing there, and there was a species that was categorised as critically endangered as a result of this particular process. And that species, there was someone at the workshop who was connected with that project who could just take that species and slot it into existing work. So so being able to do that is quite an efficient way to get the needs met. Poaching, illegal trade and persecution were threats to these groups, and 11 species ended up in that grouping. There was one species that was flagged for ex situ rescue as a species that occurs only in an area that an airport was planned for. And so that species was connected to some ex situ stakeholders who might be interested in doing some work on it. And then there were 2 species that were flagged for individual species plans. And those species were considered to be important flagships, whose needs, if met, would also meet the needs of many other species in those habitats and those areas. This is an example of some area-based planning, our first foray into plants. Actually, this was for Kenya's threatened trees, and we worked with Botanic Gardens Conservation International on this project. So we built some matrices. Because it was plants, we looked at a different array of things. We looked at things like precipitation, and we were thinking about soils, things like that. But actually, in the end, the species best grouped around sites again. So we ended up with 2 large clusters. There's still more work to do on this project. We ended up with 2 large clusters, one in an elevated area of Kenya and one down on the coastline with the sort of limestone soils. And both of those had quite a lot of threatened species in them. And so we went on from creating those groupings to doing some actual planning work with communities of actors from those 2 areas. This is the example that I talked about earlier for hoverflies. So hoverflies, because they rely so much on the microhabitats that allow them to complete their life cycles, we separated, on the basis of advice from experts, the threatened species into 3 broad categories. One category that lives on essentially the features of very mature trees, so really old trees. So they feed on the dead wood, so they rely on these very old tree features where water's got in, and there are rot holes and dying limbs. And a lot of these trees and a lot of these old features have been stripped out of forest now and cleared away from various areas for all sorts of reasons. And so we focused on that. We focused on the hoverflies that have larvae that feed on other organisms, and on the ones that feed largely actually in the bulb and root zone. So once we had those groupings, we could treat really those microhabitats as species, if you like, and think about all the reasons why they're under threat, and who we might need to have involved across Europe, really, to make sure that there was some security for hoverflies. So you know, communities like forestry and agriculture will be critical for moving forward. And we were also able to align what's already been done for pollinators across Europe with this work. So there's heaps of work has been done for pollinators across Europe. Hoverflies have sort of fallen through the cracks in some areas. We're able to track those areas and think about what those next steps might be, like taking all of the work that's already done for pollinators and giving it that hoverfly dimension. And there were people who were willing and able to take that forward. This is another example of an output. This is from the reptiles of South Asia. And this essentially species by species, we can see whether it fell into the site bucket, the habitat bucket, the threat bucket, the single species bucket, or the intensive care bucket. We can see what the next steps that were recommended are, and we can see who agreed to take them at the workshop. So this is quite a nice summary of that A2P session. These are the A2P reports that we have on our website at the moment. So please feel free to go in, take a look at any of these. They're very, very different. You'll see that they're different in style, they're different in content. What we did was different, how far we got was different. The format of the outputs is different. And we're learning as we're going, and we're finding that some things work well, some things work less well. But feel free to take a look at those, and there are 2 more on their way. What we'd like to also move forward in doing is to make more use of lots of other groups that we think could be really great regular collaborators on A2P projects, which are groups that deal specifically with these kinds of areas. So this is a very messy slide, but never mind. So for example, when we're thinking about site-based planning, we've worked with the key biodiversity area identification process, and that was super helpful in really bedding down what those key sites are, where if we could manage them really well, it would capture the needs of many threatened species. So there's that. There is, for the ecosystems red list, there is a whole commission in the IUCN that deals with ecosystems. So really connecting with them and understanding the ecosystem red list work, so that we can get a heads up when we're working on a taxon on what kinds of ecosystems are likely to be threatened and what kinds of work is being done for them would be super helpful. When we're looking at specific threats, there are specialist groups for invasive species, for sustainable use and livelihoods, for wildlife health, for trade, illegal trade. And so connecting with them to see where we could slot these species once we've put them into that threats bucket would be super helpful. We have a bunch of ex situ tools, and we work very closely with the ex situ community. So for some of those species needing intensive care, we already have tools that we can move them onto, and a community of people willing to help with that. And then we have our standard processes for those species identified as needing individual recovery plans. So making more strategic use of all of those connections is something that we're really keen to build on as we move forward. We've done a lot of A2P work now virtually, so it can be done virtually. It's great if we can do it face to face, but at least we know that it can be done. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. So just in summary, so the A2P it's like a midpoint between assessing and planning. So we're grabbing the species that are identified as threatened through an assessment process, and we're working out some pathways to effective action through perhaps further planning, but sometimes just straight to action for those species, and trying to get them on the way, just very quickly acting with urgency so that we can move more species more quickly through this assess, plan, act cycle. The basic steps are doing a whole heap of preparation, gathering the data, working out who the people need to be. And then once we have the people, we have the data, forming these multi-species groups, which is really key, and making sure that they're good groups where there really is a lot of overlap for the species included. Clarifying what the conservation needs are of those species in a kind of broad sense, working out who the people might need to be who could usefully have a conversation together about the more specific needs and how they would be done. Working out what the next steps are to getting that group together, or just to shifting that species into another planning process, or directly into action if that's possible. And then documenting and communicating that work. So those are kind of the basic steps. There are lots of steps in between there, but that's the basic cycle. For doing A2P, it's really great if you've got people in the mix who have both red list assessment skills and also planning facilitation skills. They can be in different people, obviously, but having those two sets of skills is critical to A2P. And what's next is, we really do want to keep going, trying it out on more species in more situations. Multi-taxon groups would be really interesting to try, and trying to make more formal and strategic use of those potential collaborations is what we want to do next, as well as getting that spatial nesting thing automated so that it's simpler and quicker, and we can do it more cheaply, therefore. Okay, so that's all I was going to talk about, and I hope I've left some time for questions. And again, these are all the people who've contributed so far and really helped us to develop this, and have been just willing to give it a crack, which was great.
Fantastic, Caroline. Thank you so much for that. If you have a question, it's probably best if you can write it into the chat. And then we can ask Caroline. Maybe we can, Caroline, do you want to stop sharing your screen just now, and then we can also more easily see if people want to actually turn their mics on to ask, and I can queue people up. So write in the chat, and then if you prefer to ask a question directly, if you can just turn your microphone on, but don't say anything just now, and then we'll come to you. I said, Barbara's just saying, are you looking for A2P template groups? Be helpful to do a marine example, and I think it would be a good cross-taxa example, since one of the primary threats is fisheries bycatch.
Yeah, that would be brilliant and really exciting. First of all, Jamie, I can't, how do I unshare my screen? Do you want to just shut me down? Just shut me down. Do that. Can you do that?
I'm going to take that control away from you. Yeah. So if you answer the question, and I'll strip you of your powers.
Okay. Yes. A marine example. A marine example would be great. So far out of my comfort zone, but it really, I think that really, and a multi-taxon one, all with that same threat, is exactly what this is supposed to be looking at. Although I'm just wondering if.
Oh. I think I've gone and dismissed Caroline altogether. she disappeared. Caroline, come back. All is forgiven. That was too much. Let me bring her back. I'm just going to bring her back in. Is she coming back in? Can't see where she has gone. So if you want to, we will get her back in. But if you want to just carry on sort of typing your questions into the chat for now, perhaps, and then we'll, yeah, so Caroline is back now. Caroline, apologies. I don't know whether I actually completely dismissed you.
You did.
As opposed to, I did. I'm sorry. And we've still got your thing anyway up on the screen, so ignore that. And you carry on answering the question, and I will stop trying to fiddle.
No, I don't have anything else to say other than I think that does sound like a really excellent example, and I would love to talk more with Barbara about that. If Barbara would like to say anything, that could also be good. I'm still trying to get rid of my screen.
Yeah, maybe I'll just speak up. This is Barbara. I was thinking we've started doing some concentrated work off of the West African coast because of an Atlantic humpback dolphin, but they're getting caught in small type fisheries, gill nets that are taking sawfish and manatees, and I think probably getting across taxonomic group there, and of course it's going to be multi-country as well. It wouldn't be an easy example, but I think it would be a really useful example of how to tackle a threat that's threatening a whole bunch of different species with biologists that don't normally talk to each other, both because they're in different countries and because they work with really different taxa.
Yeah, I agree. That would be fantastic, and really that's as an exercise in bringing all those people together, that could be really interesting, really cool, and I think it would show up some interesting facets of the way that those things work. I think just having those people talking to each other about a common issue would be really interesting, but I agree, not easy at all to do. But that would be a really good one.
And would that sort of thing, Caroline, would that actually be an A2P thing, or would A2P, and just also in terms of my understanding of A2P, would it allow you to go sort of into deep dive into that, or really, if you've already identified that fisheries, is the big issue, then have you kind of gone through what that's the value of A2P, is to give you your bucket? Are you starting off with that bucket, and what additional depth would A2P give you?
Yeah, I think, well, I need to talk more to Barbara about it, obviously, but I think that the first thing to do would be to work out all the species that you'd want to put in that bucket in that way. I think you probably, you start with a bucket, and there are lots of taxa that would go into that bucket, but you wouldn't, you'd want to decide which ones would go in. And also I'm imagining that there might be some sub buckets, so there might be slightly different pressures in different areas, and different pressures that are coming from different angles to do with where that pressure is occurring and what that means for different taxa. So I don't know without thinking about it in a lot more detail with somebody who actually understands it. But I'm imagining that different species will be experiencing that pressure in different ways, and that might give you different buckets and then different lever points for the conservation action that you might take, or the stakeholder groups that you might be dealing with. So that's I guess that's kind of the way that I was thinking about it, in terms of, you start with this giant bucket, but you'd be drilling down further into to look at all the different angles on that, which would create other multi-species groups.
So you'd end up with cups within buckets.
That's right. Or small nets, maybe.
Small nets. I did. If you got other questions, if you write them in the chat or turn your mic on, then I'll cue you up. But because that sort of leads on to something I was wondering about, that you A2P sucks data from the red list, although that's where there's a good source of information anyway for it, and that obviously uses particular definitions of threat categories, which for some are a bit, they're kind of difficult to kind of get your heads around and sort of to understand, and they want to find ways of simplifying it. And if you were to do as you're describing here, you might end up with threat categories that are not really what's in the red list. You'll be drilling down deeper. So how have you found that sort of flexing the red list threat categories? How much have you had to sort of play with that so that it allows for what participants want to really focus in on?
Well, so far we've only done, well, I say only, so far we we can pull out data from any of the categories, and I think for some of the projects, although I might be misremembering this, we went all the way from critically endangered to near threatened, but it becomes a size thing for us. So we you know, we've used the red list categories to narrow down the number of taxa that we're trying to do this for, because we never have very much time, and we never have you know, access to the right people for long enough. So we've had to cut things out, but we have also looked at the data deficient groups, because we know from other work that there are more likely to be that the data deficient grouping probably includes a disproportionate number of threatened taxa. And so we did, which I thought it was kind of interesting, and it worked quite well. We looked at the data deficient taxa and why they're data deficient, rather than what, you know, the list of information that people think we need for them, just looking at why it is that we know so little about them. And we managed to create some groupings around that, particularly for the reptiles of South Asia. So, you know, some of them are in remote places that are difficult to get to. It's hard to get permits, or it's dangerous to go there. Some of them just are just known from one specimen that was collected in 1890, and no one's quite sure where it came from. You know, there are lots of things like that that you can put into, you know, another set of buckets, really, and say, well, that is a body of work that you know, that a university might be willing and able to take on. This is a group of species that you could run some sort of lost species campaign type thing for. So we've been a bit flexible there. Where we haven't, you know, we haven't really had to tackle it, but we know it's coming, is where we're looking at large numbers of species within a country. You know, so the red list categories are done species wide, or they can be done at the regional level, and the hoverflies were done at regional level. So you have a red listing that is relevant to the globe or to a region, but you don't necessarily have a red list, obviously, categorization system that's relevant to a national park or to a region within a country or to a country. And so trying to work out how to cut those up using the red list data, you know, which bit of the species range is the red list data relevant to? Those kinds of things start to make it all more complicated and start to make the red list data less relevant to what we're trying to do. And so then we would need to rely much more on, you know, local databases, so national red list databases perhaps, and of course the expertise of the people that are in the project. So there are so many different ways. We thought this was going to be relatively simple, but it's always really complicated at the front end. And what we're finding as we shift species, because, you know, a lot of this single species planning is done on quite large vertebrates, really. So a lot of our single species planning experience is, although it feels like it's across lots of different taxa, they're, you know, often quite large bodied, quite charismatic, because they're the species that attract that kind of attention. As we've moved out to other species, we've found some of the red list information not specific enough. So for the invertebrates, for example, we started out carving up all of the different habitat types, the way that they're characterized in the red list. And so we did quite a lot of work on that. And then we had our first meeting with the experts, who were awesome, actually. They very, very gently and politely said, well, it's not really that relevant to invertebrates, because they don't really care whether there's a whole forest there. They just care whether this tree stump is wet, you know. It was so we had to start thinking on a whole different scale that is not captured well for good reason in the red list data standard. So what we did learn from that is that you do have to talk to the experts first in quite a lot of detail before you go off collecting data from the red list.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Caroline. There aren't any other questions. Don, I can see Christine, thank you, has responded to your question about Tamarau. So you can go and look up that. Last chance for questions just now. Yes, Oscar, the presentation will be available on the website, should be available tomorrow. I'll go in and we'll get it put up. Caroline, one last clarification. I'm right in saying is that what A2P doesn't do, apart from relatively few species where it might be just so clear cut exactly what needs to happen and you can sort of move through, it's not a replacement to planning. There's likely to be another step. Although, I mean, are we? Do you find you're a bit under sort of pressure to sort of people wanting you to sort of help through A2P to actually take everything through to right now? What are the actions? You know, is there sort of pressure to try and use it in a replacement to planning? And am I am correct in saying, I think, in that it is, as you had in that model, it is that link as opposed to morphing into some means of just moving everything through to action.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you raised that, actually, because I don't think that I was clear enough about where A2P starts and stops, and part of that is because the lines of that have become quite blurred. So in the first view that we did, we were very clear, and we were able to be very clear that we were really just looking for the next steps. What's for this species, what's the best way to get it on track to effective conservation action, and then for this one and this one and this one and this one. And so we had envisaged, you know, connecting species to spatial, you know, protected area management plans, to you know, embedding them in projects about illegal trade that were dealing with other species with the similar trade routes, that kind of thing. We'd sort of imagined that we could kind of hand species out in a way to other things, and for the ones that we couldn't hand out, that we would just set up a quick description of what the next step might be for those species in terms of planning. So things like those South Asian community-based workshops that were based around sites that the community was living around or reliant on, things like that. But you know, it depends very much on who we can have in the conversation, where the conversation starts and stops. And for some species, it's just hard not to go that extra step and start to do more detailed planning. And our hoverflies ended up being more detailed planning than we'd envisaged when we started. And Kenyan trees quite explicitly ended up being planning rather than just the A2P step. So I think it's important to have, well, I find it's important to have in my head where I think A2P stops, but obviously to be open to how far the people that we're working with are willing to push it, whilst being mindful of the time that we've got available. I don't know if that really answered your question, but yes, A2P is definitely that. It's the linking step. It's not really supposed to be the detailed planning. It's not supposed to end up with a long list of the detail of what's going to be done and where and by whom, but it is supposed to identify what more planning is needed, or broadly what action is needed and who might take that forward. That's as far as we expect to get.
And I suppose that links in back into sort of some of the principles, you know, one of which is recognizing that, you know, you don't have all the main groups you're going to have doing A2P will be the experts, and they are only a subset of the broader stakeholders that would ultimately need to buy into any actions that were going to be identified.
Yeah.
You're mentioning about timing, and actually I'm aware we're out of time, but Hernan has asked about a question about time, so I'll just quickly ask that before we do wrap up. And he's just wondering, you know, can you give a ballpark figure about how much time it might take if you're going to go through an A2P process, or is it like a length of string? You know, can you sort of give a ballpark figure of how much time it might take?
Yeah, well, it's a really good, yeah, it's a really good question, and we've tried to account for it, and they've all been so different. And because we have piggybacked so far, we have only piggybacked really on red listing projects, and so the amount of time that we have to spend on the actual A2P discussions has depended entirely on what the red list project has been able to allow for. So for some of them, we've done sessions in parallel with red listing. For others, we've had 2 whole days of planning afterwards, which again is a tiny amount of time for such large numbers of species. And then the preparation work can be huge, depending on the taxon, how many there are, and what kinds of things we, what kind of data we need to pull out that's not in the red list, or how we need to go about organising the data. So we're working on. We imagine that it's taking something like 20 to 30 days of preparation, write-up and facilitation time, something like that. But we think that some of them have gone over that and some of them might be a little under.
And within that, you've got the kind of two to a few days of actual intensive stakeholders there, the actual work. A lot of that is the prep and the follow-up bit, isn't it? The sort of big pieces of bread around this sort of thin piece of filling in the sandwich, of which is A to B. So I'm talking about food again, which is probably appropriate time to wrap up. So Caroline, thank you so much indeed for giving us that presentation. Much clearer now about A to B process. This will be on the website, and Christine, thanks for pointing that out. The other webinars in the series are also on the CPSG website, and we'll be circulating at the start of June details on what the June webinar will be about in due course. So thanks all. Have a good evening, morning, wherever you are. Caroline, enjoy your coffee and well-deserved croissant, and speak to everyone later.